Thank you very much. Can you hear me at the back there? Perfect. So, I don't want anybody to take what I'm saying today as a political talk. And the reason for it looking perhaps like that in some cases is I'm going to deal with the idea of community development initiatives being an absolute imperative. So I'm not going to talk about this slide at all, other than perhaps showing you that as an entomologist, I find an enormous amount of interest in the environment. And unfortunately, I think the insects are very often overlooked. My favorite is, I said to our manager on the farm one day, there's a thing that you find in rhino. You usually see it in the dead rhino. A big fat bot, a worm in the gut. I've never seen the adult. The adult, Gyrostigma rhinocerontes, is Africa's biggest fly. It's actually an incredibly beautiful fly. I bet you, not one person here has thought if the rhino go extinct, that being an obligate parasite, it will be extinct as well. And that's just how things are all together. So I'm going to start with the world, the human population and how it's grown. Currently, we're somewhere around about 8 billion. Depends what you read. We're going to be any 8.8, 9.2, who knows. But they've been saying for quite some time, predicting that we'll be 9 billion people by 2050. These 9 billion people have to eat. They have to make a living. So in South Africa, we're currently 61 odd million people. And if we just look at it in the sense of densities and how it's spread around the world, they've got the density of South Africa, or the density there in globally is 62 people per square kilometer. I don't know if any of you think in square kilometers, but we normally think about hectares. Well, that's pretty close to 3 people every 2 hectares. Spread across the whole world. Jeez. You'll see that South Africa is one of the sort of middle, if you like, 50 to 60% of the most populated countries per surface area. What that means is that we have a world, land, sea, but in particular land, and land usage, as you will see there from, my wife questioned the 0000. So what does that mean? When was that? I said, I don't know. But in any case, you can see how over the last 100 years, our usage of the land available has rocketed. That's because of the people. And we mentioned, of course, that there's 61 million people, but it doesn't really help if there's no employment. How do those people live? What do they eat? You'll see there that in the fourth quarter of 2022, 7.8 million people in South Africa were without work. And if you consider that half our population is in the lower end of the scale, below 35, then that's a very significant number. 6.1 million of those are actually permanently out of work. They can't find work. 42 million South Africans, 60% of us, live on less than $5 a day, roughly 100 rands. Tomorrow is probably only Well, tomorrow it might be 200 rands. If we look at the upper poverty line as it's currently calculated of 1,417 rand per person per month, then 33 million people are in poverty, half of us. If we use food poverty specifically, i.e. money available for food, and we're talking there a miserable amount. I sometimes, if I have to, and my wife doesn't want to do it for us, have to go to Woolies to buy the week's food, basically. It's going to cost you 2,000-3,000 rand for a trolley. That's not much that you'll get for 663 rands. 13 million people, a quarter of our population, live below that, don't have sufficient money to buy food. We mentioned the unemployment rate, but 61% amongst the youth. Where's the future? How do you feel when you actually don't see a future? The word that comes to my mind is the word hopeless. We'll get there. We continue with the bad news. Infant deaths, 23.6 per thousand. 30 children out of 1,000 die before they get to 5 years old. And the data that's there now comes from a book called An Empty Plate, written by Tracy Ledger. It's a bit old, 2011. I don't think it now most certainly underestimates the picture. But 68% of South African children go to school in the morning without breakfast. 8.8% are underweight because they don't have sufficient food. 24.6 are actually stunted because they don't get sufficient food. That's a quarter of the children. How many people here? Well, 100.
83.
21 of you would be stunted, according to those statistics. That's shocking. All this means that 4.8% are wasted. That's the worst type of malnutrition you can get. Wasting on your last legs. That means that 40% of South African children suffer from a measurable effect of malnutrition. It's almost half. I think after COVID, remember it's 2011, it's probably over half. And we will have all heard the last few days about the fact that 81% of learners in grade 4 can't read. Well, when you go to school without food, what do you expect? Terrible, shocking statistics. People struggling. I come from the Eastern Cape, and I'm not saying that this in any way is a politician to be admired, Lennox Sebe. He was the first president of the great Republic of Ciskei, I think 1976. In his inaugural speech, and it's something that, strangely enough, I've remembered my whole life, he said his government's policy is going to be a meal a day for everybody. That he didn't do it and all the rest is another matter. But that's what he said. And he said, the reason for that is because empty stomachs have no ears. Think about it. You're hungry. Your children are hungry. You don't have any money. You don't have a job. You're going to listen to anybody? No. We have no ears. I thought it was an exceptionally perspicacious thing to say. Not that he did the right thing after that. And I think we've seen the effects of that in July 2021 down in KZN and in Gauteng. So those are the whys, because we have a population that is in need. And how do we do it? Well, who's going to do it? After the past 30 years, I don't think we can expect it to come from the political side of things. It's only you and I that can do something. And there are two types of people in South Africa. I'm sorry to say this, us, the haves, and the have-nots. So we have a look at the have-nots. They have no skills very often. They have no education. That's something you need to be able to deliver and do things. They lack resources. They don't have money. They can't buy cattle to go farming, kind of thing. They can't buy land to go farming. Can't buy a taxi to go and be a taxi driver. But worst of all, they lack hope. In my mind, they're hopeless. But, and this is what's important, why they have no ears, they have nothing to lose. Just look at it cynically. They go to jail, at least they get a meal. Oh, and a blanket probably. And then there are the haves, which are the minority. And I'm not talking color at all. They have the skills. They have the education. They have the resources. They have the money. And more importantly, I have to say it, we are the people who have things to lose. I've said before, the government has shown that it's not really attending to what needs to be attended over the past 30 years. And we, as the haves, must work together. And this is what we're talking about today. We sit on our little island there and don't do anything. You've got something to lose and you're going to lose it. We have, and we must do something about it. But if each one of us does it on our own, or tries to do it on our own, we're not going to get anywhere. I don't think I need to say much more than that. But we do, in every way we can, in particular through community development, because that's addressing the problem, must ensure a broader, fairer, and better spread of what we have. So if we come together and we decide we want to do a community project, there's certain things that you need, a proper procedure that you need to go through. I'm not going to go into much detail about it, but on page, I think it says it there, page 51 of our magazine, there's a lady called Julia Baum, educated at UCT. Private Conservation Network is her organization, and she's laid it out very nicely. You want to attempt a conservation, in her mind, project, and if it's a community conservation project, that much better, then there is a process to follow. And that process is laid out very briefly there at the bottom. But you need to have in your mind a vision, which is the impact that you're going to make. You must include the stakeholders. All of the stakeholders, whether it's the local community, whether it's the government, the neighbors. You've got to include them in what you want to do, even if it is just to inform them. You then have to plot your course, and that's what's at the bottom there, and in the magazine. And finally, you must be able to measure progress. And for me, that's quite important. And I'll spend a bit more time on that. But for example, if you were doing a farming exercise or an animal production exercise, then you would want to know the conception rate of your cows, or of your herd. You would want to know about the weaning rate and the weaning weights and how much you sold those animals for and how many you got sold, in order to see what the real impact is. So you must have something that's measurable. And if we're dealing with communities, we also need to measure the impact on the people, on the community. And here's an example of one of the ways of doing that measurement. It was called, at the time when we used it a couple of years ago, a poverty stoplight initiative assessment. And stoplight because there's a red and a orange and a green. Green being good, orange being not so good, and red being poor. And this particular system goes to a community, a household, and asks them 50 questions. Do you have a house? Is it a brick house? Has it got running water? Has it got a flush toilet? Do you have access to credit? And a whole 50 different questions. In this particular question, which was the indicator number 1 I just took off the top, what are your earnings? Are they above 5,000 rands a month? Are they between 2,000 and 5,000? Or are they below 2,000 rand a month? Arbitrary figures. But you do the measurement. And this is a project that we started. Peter was there down at Mtonjeni, where we wanted to assist in providing 2 things to the animal owners in a communal situation. So what we did was train some community animal health workers. We provided them with medicine so that if there were ill animals, they could have technical support and treat the animals. What is interesting is that these results were 2 years after the initiation. Part of the initiation was what they called ABCD, Asset-Based Community Development. Just getting people to see, actually, I have this asset. How do I use it for development, for making an income? For example, there's a lot of second-hand clothes I have access to. I could start a little second-hand exchange shop. These results, which were 2 years and a little bit later, could not really take into account the impact of the animal production because the period was too slow, too short, and COVID had a big impact. What I'm trying to show you here is that just the fact that people were taught to think, hey, asset-based, there's something here that I can do something with. Just change of mindset made a big difference. 11% of the people suddenly earned more than 5,000 rand a month. I suppose inflation played a role. If it was last week. And I then thought perhaps I'd give a little bit of personal experience. So on our property, we gave our workers 30% share in the farm, the business, everything, the animals, the works. The government then came and bought another 20%. And I want to say gave it to them, but I kept it for themselves actually. They still, after a period of 6 or 7 years, haven't transferred the title deeds. But apart from that kind of thing, you just by being a good citizen, a participative individual, helping people with their driver's license, which is going to help you too. You don't have to get in the car and go and buy fuel. You can send somebody. Courses in hospitality, catering, firefighting, those are things that we've all used. But those are also capacity building. Those also develop the community. And skills, which is really important from the point of view of recognition, self-image, and pride in the job that you have and that you've done. We did a few research and development projects there as well, because I'm from the pharmaceutical industry. And I mention them because, well, our neighbors who will use those products in future are also a community. So I don't know if anybody's heard about the paintballs that you can use to treat your animals for ticks. That was developed here in the Waterberg at Dabchik. The same with the vaccine for wireworm in sheep mainly. And then a gentleman on the bottom there, name's Professor Abdallah Latif. Every time I think of him, my heart breaks because he's a Sudanese and you know what's going on there. He's an expert in the different filarias. Those are tick-borne diseases that can kill cattle. East Coast fever you would have heard of. And are very strictly controlled. And when they come and test your animals, whether they be buffalo, because buffalo have to be Filaria parva free, otherwise you're not allowed to keep them. There are a number of other filarias which can confuse the test. So there's always research going on there. And this professor was doing it, looking at the ticks and trying to find out what filarias are in them on our place. And he found a new one in buffalo. So we're going to have Filaria dabchiki one of these days. And then WRSA put together with SANBI a project, and I think this illustrates the point enormously. We, as some game farmers and the WRSA office, would get 21 graduate, whether it be a diploma or a degree. I don't know what you call it, someone with a diploma. With a degree, you've got a, yeah, exactly. Diplomat doesn't sound quite right, hey? Anyway, these people either have to have a conservation degree or a conservation diploma, game management diploma, and so on. And they, apparently, because there's a lot of them without work, without jobs, SANBI is funding them as interns, hoping that at least they'll get experience, which helps them get jobs later, or maybe they'll get jobs where they are. The tragedy is 21. There were 1,070 applicants. These are people with degrees or diplomas looking for jobs. Desperate people. The salary, 6,080 rands a month. Either a diploma or a degree or 7,000. It went up to a doctorate, actually, where they got 10,800. So it died. I've been talking too long. Sorry. Anyway, long and the short of it is there's a huge need out there. And SANBI are doing something which is rather nice. I'm not going to, I think my time is probably done. So this was the project we did in the Eastern Cape. I showed you some of the results, and it was just to get people to get an income from their asset, cattle. They got cattle, but people don't want to buy them because they don't have a proper history of their health and the like. One of the projects that was closest to my heart as a community project, there's a disease, well, 62% of all cases of epilepsy in the Eastern Cape are as a result of a tapeworm cyst on the brain. That tapeworm has got a cycle through pigs. In pigs, in the meat, you get the little, they call it pearly pork, little cysts. If you don't cook that meat properly and you eat it, you get a tapeworm. I need a tapeworm, actually. And the consequence, if you self-infect with that, is a cyst on the brain and epilepsy. And you can imagine the impact of having a young, say, 7-year-old, 15-year-old child with epilepsy. That person's life is destroyed. I don't know if anybody knows Eusebius Mackenzie.
Yes.
Sad news. And he was an epileptic. Anyway, that is an absolute tragedy. That person can't go and work very often, and then the parents and the family have to look after them. But it's easily solved. And one of the ways is there's a vaccine. You can vaccinate the pigs. You can treat the pigs to kill the cysts. Then you vaccinate them to prevent them getting new cysts, and you break the cycle, and you don't get new cases of epilepsy. We did that down in the Eastern Cape. And it's one of the most successful things that we've ever done. But from all this, what are the important lessons that I've extracted? They may or may not be relevant. On my property, after giving workers 30%, before the government bought them the rest, the workers that were there at that time still brought poachers. And after a long discussion, we realized that it doesn't help to say, you're a millionaire. You own 2 million rands worth of asset. But he can't feed his family, or he can't buy himself a car, or he can't pay for medical things. He's got an asset, but doesn't have a bigger income as a result immediately. So one has to not focus only on the long term. You also need to focus on their short-term needs. I say forget government, I mean in particular DALRID, Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. They, 6-7 years, they haven't transferred, they haven't stuck to their contract. In fact, they're much more of a hindrance than anything else. So the lesson there for me is, and we were talking about it earlier today, we've got the assets, we've got the education. We need to do it, so we must get together and do it. We can't wait for others. It's really what I'm trying to say. And then there needs to be proper communication of the details, especially with the community. They must understand why you want to do it, because obviously from the beginning there's suspicion. And you need to be able to say, to take away that suspicion so that they understand what you're trying to achieve and buy in with that. Proper evaluation, as I said, such as the poverty assessment, stoplight assessment. And if you do one project properly, you create a proper track record. The next funding that you need to look for, or your first funding maybe, will be that much easier. So unless there are other questions, and that's why our property is called Dabchick. Because when we first arrived, there's a dam there, and it was just full of dabchicks.